to Latilia Live, the next in a series of live chats that we're doing on the intersection of technology and society and the consequences and opportunities that are emerging in those spaces. Today, we're talking about privacy. So I'd like to welcome, my name is John Egan. I'm the CEO of Atelier, based here in Paris. And I would like to introduce the guests we have on today. First of all, we have Dr. Gabriela Coleman. She's a Diana Forsyth Prize-winning anthropologist and Wolfe Chair in Scientific and Technology Literacy at McGill University. She's well known for her work and writings on Anonymous, and she's the author of Coding Freedom, The Ethics and Aesthetics of Hacking, and Hacker, Hoaxer, Whistleblower, Spy, The Many Faces of Anonymous. We also have Rand Hindi, or Dr. Rand Hindi, founder and CEO of ZAMA, an end-to-end encryption solution for artificial intelligence, and formerly the CEO and founder of Snips, which was recently sold to Sonos. And we have Michell Zappa, a brilliant futurist based in Sao Paulo, founder and CEO of Envisioning, a technology foresight institute. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining me today. So we are taking on kind of a big concept today, privacy and the consequences of the denigration of privacy over the coming decade. So what I would like to do to get us started is establish some table stakes, get a sense of what we can agree on and maybe where some disagreements might exist. What is privacy? In the world we live in today, it seems far more complicated than it has in decades past. So can I start maybe, Gabriella, with you? What is privacy?
Sure. So I see privacy at kind of two levels. Privacy affords a zone of freedom and refuge where you're not being watched and surveilled. And that also means that you have the ability to control what's known about you, whether that's your identity, your health information, and other information about yourself and others.
Do you think that's an additional component that has emerged over maybe the last decade or two that didn't exist prior to that? Because that idea of owning that information is maybe much more relevant today than it was in centuries past.
Right, absolutely. I mean, you know, there's always been elements about yourself and your relationships that related to zones of freedom. But today, because so much information and data is generated about us that then exists online, the level of information is both far more deep, far more broad, and far more granular than ever before.
Michelle, to what extent does society construct a problem when the traditional understanding of privacy was the first part of Gabriela's definition, but the advancements that we've made over the last 3 decades in particular has created this new set of concerns which are relevant to the second part of her definition, which society hasn't actually constructed the legislation or the institutions actually to cater for. We don't have easy facilities to own or control the data that's there about us.
I think it has to do with the rate of change and the amount of information that is being generated. So I think it was not unforeseen. I think many people have been highlighting this scenario for a while. I think social networks emphasize that, and I think sort of so much of what's going on in machine vision and machine learning lends itself to be used towards invading privacy. Because it allows a centralized organization to learn about what the collective is doing, and there are obvious benefits to it. But I think, yeah, the rate of change is what is so staggering, because it's unlocking all of these scenarios in such short order.
Yeah. So to what end is that rate of change and maybe commensurate or corresponding rate of complexity actually creating an issue where the normal person, the average person, does not understand the consequences of something like this and the damage it might do to them or the way it might undermine systems, because we've reached a point, a certain type of complexity singularity, where only experts can really understand a particular domain at this point. And even people who sit adjacent to it might not really fully comprehend the consequences of an incremental innovation in a space, especially like privacy. So to what end, though, can we expect the average person to really understand the consequences of the depreciation of privacy in a world that's as complex as it is now?
So I would actually argue that it's gotten better, because I mean, you could make the argument that the issue of only experts understanding the implications of privacy has always been true. The general population hasn't shown much interest, I think. But I think something shifted over the last few years. And I think some of the, again, the social network scandals, like when we realized how much it actually affects democracy and sort of and everything related to public opinion, I think has shifted the conversation. I don't know if I've been hanging out in Berlin too much, but like there are pockets of people who are behaving differently already and that are sort of demonstrating that, it can be done. Sometimes they can overdo it. I think some cultures have been concerned about privacy for longer than others. Collectively, the Swiss come to mind as well. They've always had, they've had a strong concern around personal information privacy before it became cool, so to speak. But I think the general population is picking up on it. And I think the failures of the social networks is in many ways pushing that.
So Rand, I want to bring you in there because you occupy this really small part of a Venn diagram, which is, as long as I've known you, somebody who has been obsessed about privacy and the consequences of the deconstruction of privacy, but at the same time obsessed with and preoccupied with technologies that are actually, in a lot of instances, stripping away privacy from people. And all the work you've done is to try and maybe not reverse that trend, but to use that technology in a different way. So building on Michelle's point, which is, to some extent, the world is becoming more aware of it. You're actually constructing commercial entities now to take advantage of that awareness, to the ability for people to make decisions that provide them privacy without necessarily diminishing the level of access to technology or capacity or utility that they might have. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. And I've learned quite a few things on the way. The first one is that people don't actually care about privacy, which is exactly the reason why companies who are offering and building technologies should guarantee privacy by design. I think, the ideal scenario is not asking people to actively do things to protect their data, but rather for people to just go on and kind of like trust that the system is built in a way that doesn't negatively impact them. The same way that you can live in a city today, in Europe, for instance, without having to worry about, a war or being killed by someone or, anything really major. You shouldn't have to worry about what happens online with your privacy. And, the technologies to enable that are starting to appear. It's only really since the 80s that we've had this new modern way, for example, of doing encryption, which enabled communications to be secured. Prior to that, there was no way of doing it efficiently. This led, to a whole group of people starting to think about the implications of, encryption and cryptography on the internet. In the 80s, you had a group of people called the cypherpunks. The cypherpunks were a bunch of geeks and researchers in cybersecurity, cryptography, who talked about the future of what was the nascent internet. And from the group of cypherpunk, we had a lot of people create what we now consider to be base tools for privacy. Things like, encryption for emails, PGP. Things like, WikiLeaks, Assange was a cypherpunk. Bitcoin came out of a cypherpunk that we don't know, one or many cypherpunks. All of like the things
Definitely
around.
Definitely not Craig Rice.
Definitely not, that's for sure. So I think like the culture around it has been around for 40 years, but now it actually works. I'd like to make also like a comment about the way that privacy has been approached in Europe. I think Europe is in a very different situation than the United States because we've been really focused on privacy since after the Second World War. In France, for instance, during the Second World War, the Nazis, when they occupied France, went to the government files. So the government back then had individual files on people for census, which at the time seemed to be fair. So the Nazi came to those files and used it to target Jews and whoever else they actually wanted to kill. And so after the Second World War, France actually created a law that prevented government from keeping individual data after they'd aggregated it for census. And from that, we eventually had, data protection law in the 70s, which already gave things like, the right to access your data, to modify your data, and even things which are very futuristic, like the right to say no to an automated treatment. And eventually that became pretty much a GDPR. So I think like in Europe, because we had a major fuck up, 70 years ago, we're now like really concerned that someone else might abuse this data, which, we see happen on a daily basis again.
Yeah, great point. It kind of leads, I was going to ask about the importance of privacy, but you've kind of moved us right along that track, especially given what's happening at the moment. Michelle wants to say something on that. I think Michelle, you're on mute, I think.
You're muted.
Oh, sorry, I was going to ask, unless Gabriella was going to ask something first, but I wanted to ask Rand about whether people are are people willing to pay for this?
No. And, I mean, are you willing to pay for WhatsApp? Are you willing to pay for, connecting to a website over an encrypted communication channel? No. But eventually, companies that don't do it will not make as much money. So it's indirect financial benefits to the companies doing privacy. Once encryption becomes cheap and super easy to integrate, it becomes a no-brainer to do it. Right? It's what we've seen. Prior to Snowden, only 20% of web traffic was encrypted. After the revelation of Snowden, people started introducing all kinds of easy way to literally encrypt the traffic between your browser and a web server. And now 80% of web traffic is encrypted. So
because it has a computational cost and not a human cost, and the computational cost goes down over time.
Exactly. So maybe 10 years ago, someone would pay for an encrypted phone. I mean, probably people did back then, but today you don't have to anymore because the cost of integrating encryption in communication is zero, and so everybody just does it by default. There's no reason not to.
Gabriella, you were going to say something there as well, I think.
Well, I mean, it was in reaction to some of the comments that came earlier, which were all great. And I mean, I completely agree that the more we could sort of bake in, privacy and anonymity capabilities and technology, so people don't have to think about it, the better, right? But nevertheless, I do think that it's really important to also focus on educating the public to sort of get them on board with believing in privacy and anonymity. And Snowden and some of the scandals with Facebook and Cambridge Analytica made that work a lot easier, right? But I do believe that with the right sort of education and literacy, you could really change people's minds over this topic. They just both have to learn about like what you gain. And I think the tough part related to technology is there's so many vectors by which data can be collected about you. The technology changes all the time, that just trying to sort of explain all the different components of privacy violating technologies and possibilities, that's the part that is difficult, especially because technology is always changing and there's so many different actors at play.
So perhaps, maybe to build on that, I mean, we clearly need people to care about privacy if we want companies to adopt privacy by default, by design, right? So it's kind of like a chicken and egg. And you're right, we cannot educate people on every single potential privacy abuse, but we can perhaps make them aware of the importance of privacy as a general concept so that the collective mindset is that everything should have privacy by design. It doesn't even matter if you understand how it works anymore. It's just like, if a company offers a service and another company offers the same service, but with privacy guarantees, it becomes like, oh yeah, of course I'm going to take the one that offers privacy guarantees, even if I don't understand what the privacy risks are in this other company, right? So like, it's a collective shift in the way of thinking, which is happening. I think it's happening, at least in Europe.
Michelle?
Rand, do you think Google will be around in a decade?
For sure. I think those companies are way too big and way too talented, have way too much money and kind of like, monopolistic access to data and markets. Even if Google had no more data, they still have a lot of utility, right? And so, you do a Google search because it works, because it's useful. And if it becomes a necessity for Google to be able to offer a search engine with privacy, just to keep being the #1 search engine, they probably will. And in fact, you can actually do advertising without access to user data. with things like homomorphic encryption, you can literally compute data encrypted. So Google could still be serving ads without knowing anything about the users or without knowing anything about what people are searching, what ads are being served. It's just that the technology wasn't mature enough for that to happen.
So this circles back to a point I was making a minute ago. Gabriella, you talked about along that technology usage chain, there are so many different points at which your privacy can be incrementally stripped away from you without you knowing. And maybe you use a VPN, and maybe you're using Brave when you browse, and you're taking steps. You know, you're semi-aware of it, probably much more literate or fluent than most people are. But there are still you've missed 90% of the gaps of which your data can be seized, or it can be used.
We still use Zoom, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Here we are doing this on Zoom. It's a perfect point. So and there's a utility conversation there as well, but kind of going back to Rand's point a little bit, when the complexity issue is so significant that even somebody who is reasonably fluent in this conversation about privacy is still unable to, because of the offering or because of unawareness, they're unable to totally mitigate the privacy concerns. That's an issue because the technology changes and because of innovations, whatever else. And it leads me kind of back to this consideration, which is it needs to be almost cultural. It needs to be much more systemic than putting all of the pressure on the individual to know that and to understand it and to make those decisions. And I really like Rand's point about the distinction between a European point of view on this and an American or Chinese point of view on this, because yeah, you're right. The root of this is, fall of the Soviet Union, for instance, as well. Building on that, we saw satellite states across Eastern Europe, and then ultimately when it collapsed of Stasi in the GDR, you saw people raiding police stations to burn files because there was informants, etc. through that time, or people who had been spied upon. You had all of this blackmail evidence, but all these people are needed to be destroyed. And I think it's some of the most powerful imagery from that particular point in history, is that the thing that people were so consumed by in that moment oftentimes was not the joy of liberation or of hope or of anything else, but was the fear that they had all of a sudden become more vulnerable than they had before because their privacy was now compromised. And that's a fascinating concept that I do agree around. It is it forms the foundational principles of the European view on privacy, which has taken enormous steps forward in the last decade, but it goes to the heart of maybe why this is important now, especially when we consider, or we look at things like the Black Lives Matter movement in the US and spreading across the world. You would imagine at some point that conversation is going to evolve into more than just the visual targeting of people, but actually the quantitative targeting of people as well through data manipulation. So I really like that point. So if we take that a step forward, then we've now kind of clarified, well, what privacy is to some extent, and then we've also established why it's important, because it makes us extremely vulnerable when we don't have privacy. Is that fair? Everyone agree on that? It's actually, privacy is more about preventing vulnerabilities than providing us with opportunities.
Okay. Can I add something to that?
Yeah.
I actually think that privacy is also about making technology feel safe to use. I think there is a growing concern around the implications of using technology, and given that more and more technology relies on data to actually offer some kind of utility, there's a direct link between what you perceive as, ooh, if I use that thing, there might be negative consequences, and the ability to protect privacy. So I think that privacy by design fundamentally is also about making just people feel safe using technology, which in turn should be helping drive adoption of technology in many different places that we don't use it today.
Gabriella?
Yeah, just a quick point. I mean, completely agree. I also think it's important to talk about certain technologies like, surveillance cameras and facial recognition AI, where people don't even have control as to whether they get used or not. And you need, political pressure in order to kind of eliminate those. And to your point, John, I mean, we've seen companies this week like Amazon and IBM say they're going to step back and institute moratoriums on these technologies precisely because of Black Lives Matter, right? So you have these critical junctures where people collectively are made aware of the risks and can act at those moments, which is really exciting. But I do want to differentiate between technologies like your browser or your phone, which you have control over, and then other technologies which we don't even have a choice, and we have to apply political pressure from the outside in order to kind of basically render them obsolete.
A seamless segue. So we're moving from the idea of individual privacy then to the idea of surveillance systems and surveillance states. And I think everybody's probably seen the mixed reality hardware that's been used in China for policing, for example, and how there's instant data provided on vehicles and individuals through massive facial recognition infrastructure and integrated IoT and AI. And it's moving very, very quickly. This is not something which is really feasible 10 years ago. But if we're looking at the really significant technological jumps over the last decade, there's very few places where we've really advanced as quickly or as significantly as we have in surveillance infrastructure. It's quite extraordinary. So how do we reconcile those things, Gabriella? The idea that we just talked about, the idea of individual privacy, and we can take individual steps to try and mitigate some of those problems. How do we manage surveillance states, and how do we cultivate pressure?
Right. So there's exactly certain places, such as, let's just say, work, right, where you may or may not have a choice as to what technologies are used upon you. And then there's, of course, governments and their use, deployment of surveillance. And here I just don't, I think that technology has a huge role insofar as, the technology itself is a vehicle for people to start to learn about privacy, care about anonymity, right? So it's both an actual, technology, but it's also a cultural vessel. But you need to apply political pressure through protests by supporting organizations like the ACLU and the EFF. I also think supporting whistleblowers, who are some of the ones who are willing to kind of step up and reveal what states do. And this work will never end, right? I think that anytime you have a government, especially that has intelligence organizations, they will tend towards abusing their surveillance power. And you always have to have mechanisms in place to both reveal the abuse of power, limit it. And then the hardest part is try to kind of have forms of accountability when those surveillance powers are abused. We don't see that very often. But I just feel like you need to apply political pressure, from protest to supporting the types of organization that will do the legal work that's necessary to curtail that activity.
Michelle?
Gabriella, do you think it's possible to establish sort of international norms? Because taking the examples we know, the US is distinct from Europe, distinct from China. So what are your thoughts on that?
It's a good question. Certainly the UN has come out in favor of anonymity, right, and privacy. And that is a strong political statement. I don't feel like the UN has particularly strong teeth to kind of establish those norms. But actually, I do think the European Union is really indicative, or a really good example to turn to, because if they're able to kind of create a framework, and this is a little bit more on the corporate side, but nevertheless still important, that establishes the need and the legal framework to protect privacy and anonymity, and does so successfully, it then provides a kind of anchor point for other countries to follow suit. So in that regard, I think it's really important and can help pave the way to kind of more global norm setting in this sphere.
I agree.
What do you think the incentives are for that to happen? Sorry. As in, how do you incentivize people to do that? Because it's easy for us Europeans to say that the rest of the world should behave like us, but how do you make that happen?
I think, again, this is where you have to sort of put it on the table over and over again and make it clear what the risks are if you don't have that framework, right? And there are political moments like the Cambridge Analytica scandal, like today with Black Lives Matter and facial recognition surveillance, where that becomes clear, right? So you have to capitalize on those moments in order to sort of keep that pressure on and move forward, because it is difficult. You know, there's a lot of companies, especially in the United States, and also the government really, it's not in their interest to move in that direction.
Yeah, and I think it's also interesting that, you know, privacy is an issue with regards to companies and with regards to governments. And the way that people have been approaching both are quite different. So for instance, for protecting privacy with regards to companies and products we use every day, you know, we have something like the GDPR. And the GDPR actually ended up radiating far beyond Europe, because, you know, companies like Facebook, for instance, initially said, we're only going to give GDPR protection to European users, not to American citizens. And so American citizens came and said, why not? Are we not worthy of privacy? And so Facebook was like, fuck, now I need to give it to everyone. So they just made it by default for everybody on Facebook. So Facebook is actually, you know, GDPR compliant for people in the US as much as people in Europe, which is a pretty big deal when you think about it. So I think like the globalization of technology forces companies to adopt whatever is the best practice and the most strict practice, which in this case is Europe. But government-wise, we don't have that, right? The best we have are like companies like Apple basically saying no. The best we have is end-to-end encryption that you put in your product so that you're not even responsible. If a government comes and subpoenas you, you're like, I don't have the key. Go get it in Europe. Go get it in China. Go get it on the user's phone. That's how you protect against it, and whistleblowers, of course, which I think is a very important part of this equation.
Gabriella?
I was going to say, I mean, I think you've explained why a move in one place can reverberate elsewhere, and it's really important. I mean, since this is a little bit oriented towards the future as well, I do hope that one day we can create technologies where we do have decentralized social web that doesn't require a centralized company, right? And so even as we should work on the present to force these companies to change their ways and do what we can to provide frameworks of protection, I actually do also believe that technology can really provide sanctuaries that are much more robust than exist today. And it might take another 5, 10, 15, 20 years for that to happen, but that should always also be part of the calculus as well.
Agreed, and it's a very, you know, when we push forward the thinking on privacy, at some point, you know, we got to realize that even with privacy by design everywhere, right, it doesn't prevent people from abusing the service, even if that service doesn't know who you are, what you're doing. So something like Cambridge Analytica could still have existed even if Facebook had no access to your actual data. Because, well, as long as Facebook can do advertising, Cambridge Analytica could have used it to manipulate people, right? Even if this is done completely in the blind, completely decentralized or encrypted, the usage is still out there. And so at some point, you know, privacy can only be protected technically when it comes to control and access. But when it comes to what is acceptable use of data, then that's much more of like an ethics question, right? And that belongs to, I believe, you know, people, states to actually put a stick and say, we as a population, as a government, do not agree on this kind of use of, you know, technology, period. Facial recognition is a good example. It doesn't matter how much privacy you have, you got to just forbid it, you know, by just ethics, you know.
So there's two sides to this point, I think. One is that at an individual level, privacy is important because if it gets stripped away from us, we can be discriminated against based on a number of different vectors or characteristics that may not be. And we haven't talked about genetic privacy or anything either with genetic data. So there's a whole plethora of different ways that data can be used against us to remove or decrease social mobility, for instance, or to prevent opportunities, or to favor people over somebody else for a variety of reasons. But there is another side of this as well, which is the the large number of social manipulation of a society, which we've touched on now a few times with Cambridge Analytica, where a single country was convinced into an extraordinary act of self-sabotage through the actions at a reasonably small amount of money. It took a very small amount of resources to convince an entire country to radicalize itself and to inflict upon itself this, this extraordinary historic level of self-harm without any mechanism that the government had or the people had to counteract it. So there seems to me there's two sides to that conversation, and how that data can be aggregated and can be used to manipulate people. Again, Michelle, in Brazil, we've seen it happen quite a lot because the attitudes towards the collection of social media data seems to be a lot more lax in Brazil than they've become in other places. How do we begin to conceptually differentiate those two things? And I would also direct to Rand a question, which is, how can the technology which is doing this harm actually be part of the solution?
I think in the case of Brazil, what really struck me when the elections happened a few years ago was the power of WhatsApp, and like in terms like the ease people had in forwarding things on WhatsApp. Like the network effects on the tools were out of control. Like you could forward any amount of messages to any amount of recipients, and that, so even more so than Facebook ads or anything like in the US, I think here, like one of the underlying issues was that, and they even locked it down after the elections. Like you can only forward, they capped it somehow. But I think it goes to show that the power these tools have, even if it isn't centralized, has to be checked.
Gabriella?
So I've finished a large project on the history of the security industry and how former non-malicious black hat hackers who broke into systems emerged out of the shadows to force companies like Microsoft to finally fix vulnerabilities, right? And it's a fascinating history because it took just this enormous external pressure to shame the vendors and engage in full disclosure, where they're like, okay, we're gonna drop the flaw and maybe even the exploits. And at first, Microsoft was like, no, that's the problem. And everyone else was like, no, you're the problem. Now, the reason why I raise this is that I'm using this work with a collaborator to think about social technical vulnerabilities in the present. And, companies like Facebook, one of the big problems is they're not willing to release the data. There's no transparency about what's happening with the data and how our privacy is being violated and how actually the data can be used to manipulate people, right? And so there's no way of sort of even understanding the nature of the problem. And Facebook was going to release the data to the Social Science Research Council for researchers in the area of manipulation, and then they pulled out, right? And so again, I think we have to now force these companies to have the forms of transparency that are necessary to even understand some of the ways in which privacy is being violated or other forms of kind of manipulation are being enacted, right? And dealing with a problem, socio-technical vulnerabilities and flaws is really, really complicated because again, there isn't a sort of incentive or reason for these companies to release this data.
Yeah, and it actually even doesn't take too much to make a change. I mean, think about what happened, a decade ago with a little bit less than that, with Max Schrems in Europe, right? So Max was like he was a law student, right? And he was doing his thesis on the fact that Facebook was violating European privacy law. So this was way before GDPR and everything, right? Back then, as a US company, you could just like bring European data back to the US pretty openly. He single-handedly was able to sue Facebook to get his data. So Facebook sent him like 1,000 pages of data on a like CD, right? And from that, he actually took down the regulation that enabled American companies to export data, which eventually gave ground to the whole debate, which gave ground to GDPR. So like a law student who was just like, I'd say had enough belief in this important thing that he just went all the way was able to literally reshape the entire way that we deal with data in Europe and with American companies. So it's definitely doable, and we just need more examples of that. We need more examples of like obvious, like what's going on kind of moments.
Okay, so we've now kind of constructed a dynamic which is individual, corporate, state, and there's challenges at every level of this, and there's different incentives at every level of this as well, and different complexities. And I want to move us on just slightly onto the next stage of this conversation as well, which is when we introduce anonymity. But to what extent, when we consider that dynamic, is some level of, is it necessary for us as citizens, as part of a community, to cede some level of data? Are the protocols that just surround that, like the idea of a surveillance state, is there an acceptable level of surveillance for people? Is it okay to have cameras on streets that have facial recognition as long as the data is processed and deleted after a certain period of time? Or is that unacceptable, full stop? For a long time now, the threat of terrorism has been used to force through legislation and infrastructural action that people would have found unappealing, I think, in the not too distant past. But to what extent are we at a point now, can we reflect over the last 15 years of advancements in a surveillance state and say, well, some of it might be warranted, but some of it is not, or vice versa?
Well, I'm in the camp that favors, sorry, Brand, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, I mean, briefly, I'm in the camp that favors having some degree of, I mean, you need regulation, but you also need the tools to be in place. So prohibiting it entirely, as some people seem to indicate, I don't think that's a good solution, because there are many groups who are, vulnerable and targeted, where the security arrangements can actually benefit. So yeah, so I'm in favor of having it and just having a good understanding of what it's capable of and what the laws are to make sure that happens.
Do you think anyone feels safer as a result of the data that's been collected over the last 15 years? Do you think people feel safer now or before? And is that a question of ignorance and awareness, or is it a question of actually, is the world fundamentally more dangerous now than it was? Right?
Well, you see, the way you're asking the question also is very important. Do people feel safer? Yes. Are people actually safer? Not necessarily, right? So it depends on whether you just want to have a smokescreen of safety, or if you're actually trying to solve the problem. Like, for instance, when it comes to terrorism, we know that the best way to actually identify terrorists is to get tips from people and to do human surveillance, right? So, getting like the social networks and getting neighbors calling saying something's weird is happening. Way more than mass surveillance, right? Way more than mass surveillance. However, mass surveillance sounds like a great idea, so it makes people feel safe. And I think we kind of lost the debate on mass surveillance when Obama, who was supposed to be one of the, presidents kind of like in favor of this modern take on these topics, had to back the NSA by saying, yeah, just like when you go to the airport and get scanned, we got to scan what you're doing, in case you're a terrorist. That was it. Like, who else, if not Obama, was going to actually, push against that? And to be clear, I think there is value in surveillance when it comes to individually targeted surveillance. I don't see much value in mass surveillance. And even if there was, value, you need some kind of counterpower to push back against abuses, which comes back to the discussion around whistleblowers. If the people who would ring the alarm on the government going too far with surveillance actually end up in jail, who's there to prevent the government from abusing?
Gabriella?
So it could be just really as simple as saying, whistleblowers, you have a job, which is to say when something's been really wrong.
I think that's a challenge. Let's come back to that in a minute, though. Incentivizing whistleblowers is a difficult thing to do, especially with the way society treats them there afterwards. Gabriella, you were going to come in there with something, I think.
Yeah. So, just to sort of, honor the current moment. Obviously, I completely agree with everything that has been said by Rand, which is at the level of sort of national security. In the United States, and I think this is also the case in a few other countries, we've seen how the police force is highly militarized and they are given capabilities from drones to access to facial recognition software and AI that is a mechanism for control and doesn't necessarily lead to security and safety, right? So it costs enormous amount of money, and that money can be used for social services and education, which provides security. That provides social security, stability, right? And again, you know, you're not going to entirely get rid of the police, but I think it is okay to say, you know, we don't want that at all, both because it harms certain population. The money takes away funds that could provide other services that provide security, a different type of security. And so that conversation is currently happening, which is extremely exciting, and a moment to say, no, we don't want those technologies at all. They're harmful and they don't provide any sort of benefit to the communities that are being served.
Agreed.
I'd like to dwell on that for a moment, because it's probably the most important thing we can talk about at the moment is what's happening, in particular in the US. And none of us, so Gabriella, you're a US citizen, but none of us are from the US. So maybe we've got somewhat of a more neutral point of view when we're looking at it. But we have seen in the United States in particular, since 9/11, the extreme militarization of the police force, massive levels of funding. And now they're being equipped with these data assets and these data competencies. So what we're creating is this very, very volatile environment, it would seem. And there's no reason to think that this won't be replicated elsewhere. You would expect that most police forces across the world, particularly armed police forces, will look at the US police force with some level of envy with the resources that they have. So what is to stop other countries taking the same approach, massively funding, massively militarizing police forces, equipping them with data, and then allowing them to use their own judgment effectively and protecting them with legislation against the actions that they do take, against a very vulnerable society who are totally overmatched by a Space Force type police force. Anybody want?
No, I mean, that's why it's so important to basically demonize it and say it's not acceptable, right?
Yeah.
To put it in the category of, to use a kind of past example, eugenics, where people who were disabled or had mental health issues were literally targeted as being unwanted, and it was like okay to sterilize them, right? And everyone thought this was progressive, and it was the basis for the kind of Nazi program. And then at a certain point, society goes, oh my gosh, that was a big mistake. Let's not ever go there. I think we need to do the same with a class of surveillance technologies, right? Yeah. And just demonize it to the extent that it becomes unacceptable, so that it's not easily adopted. It will be adopted in different nations around the world, but hopefully it will be harder to do if it has a really bad association.
Yep.
Yeah, and the good thing is, we already have our case example of the worst potential startup you could ever build in that space. There's a company called Clearview AI that literally scraps the internet and gives police facial recognition tools so that they could find people's pictures everywhere. Right. I was making a joke on Twitter, which I guess not very many people understood, that like the founder of the company is like the Martin Shkreli of artificial intelligence. Like he found a way to massively fuck up, right? And make the most unethical use of a technology ever. Like it's insane.
And he has ties to white supremacists and the far right. There's a very good piece by Luke O'Brien about it, right? And so we have to both expose the harms of the technology, and also in this case is a perfect example where the political ideologies of those building the technology are extremely suspect as well.
Yeah, Cambridge Analytica, same thing, right? You had someone who was a strong believer in ultra-conservative kind of views, and he just basically worked with whoever he wanted to see win. And I guess that's also a much bigger debate. But to what extent are CEOs of technology companies supposed to be neutral, right? I mean, the media doesn't have to be. So why should a company be, right? Why should Google be neutral, why can't they bias the search result if a company can decide only to work with one type of customer and one another, right?
Yeah, these companies are coming like the Blackwater companies are equivalents of data or of privacy.
Actually, if anything, Blackwater doesn't care who hires them, right? So if anything, Blackwater is like, hey, just pay us, we'll send people.
As long as they get to kill people. So a question is coming from Twitter about the idea that, let me just read this. It's the idea that the companies who are maybe the most pervasive data hunters and collectors are the ones who are making extraordinary wealth. So this is from Poem Producer on Twitter. You'd be interested to think about the wealth accumulated through privacy exploitation of the 99% of the entire planet by the tech 1%. How is it acceptable and what could actually be done? It just seems relevant at this point. So what we clearly see is the most valuable companies in the world today are not companies necessarily who are producing enormous dividends for their investors. They're companies who are exhibiting extraordinary levels of influence and power. And the thing they're doing every year is they're increasing that sphere of influence more and more every year, and they're seeing capital appreciation or share price as a consequence of it. So you've got this very small group of what are increasingly becoming kind of virtual libertarians who are extremely powerful, extremely wealthy, and they're doing it off the backs of data which was seized from people, oftentimes without their knowledge. Is there a way to challenge that? Maybe Rand, actually, this is a perfect moment for you to come in and say, yes, there's a technology here that can help.
So, I mean, yes, there is a technology that can help, but more generally speaking, I think it's, I don't even think this is a privacy issue, right? I think this is more a question of, how do you build an ethical technology company overall? And I don't have the answer to that. I still feel that, like, when I look around myself and I look at my friends who are building companies, clearly, you need to have this, almost irrational belief in wanting to do something good in order to make decisions which are not purely financially motivated in the short term. And quite frankly, I'm going to be honest, the best way to exert influence, positive or negative, is to build a massive company, right? So, I thought about this at some point because I was involved quite a bit with the French government, advising them on quite a few digital policy stuff. And I realized I can write the most amazing reports with the best arguments for against something. They're only going to pick whatever they want to put forward. But I can build a company, right, with the same ideas and make it so big that they have no choice but to listen to what I'm saying. And that actually creates even more change down the line. So I think, we're all motivated by different reasons, but I think that if you want to have a positive change, you should definitely bake that into the culture of your company.
Michelle, you want to say something?
Gabriella, want to say something?
Yeah, I mean, I think about something like Tor, right? Which is a kind of network on top of a network. And it's not a company, right? It's a sort of nonprofit and open source that over the years has really developed and matured. I'm on the board, so I have to say good things about it. But in all seriousness, I've seen it. I worry a lot about its future because of funding, right? And I mention this because I still am skeptical that, with a few exceptions, that a company can really, grow big and provide investors with, returns and not violate privacy and so on and so forth, right? I mean, I'd like to see this happen, but I'd like to hear more about what you think are the areas where it is possible, and often it is finance, because you need secure, channels, but there might be other areas which is much harder to kind of finance through corporations, and you need different kind of funding models in order to bring these technologies.
Tor is a great example, or Jitsi, if we're talking about, video conferencing.
Right.
We have great open source alternatives. And actually, it's funny, I was going to write an op-ed specifically on the topic of, open source alternative to companies. Funding is the issue.
It is.
Tor needs $1 billion. right? So how do you find $1 billion? 3 years ago, you would do an ICO. That was a great way to fund the project, right? Today, it's unclear. So is there a way that, you can maybe do like a Mozilla type of structure with like a for-profit company that's basically funding the nonprofit company that actually, owns infrastructure is critical. But this is essential. And Gabriella, I'm really glad that you guys are figuring this out, because I've been also following Tor for quite some time, and it should be way bigger and way harder to corrupt than it has been in some countries. Right. And this is really just money, right? You need money, and you need servers, and you need people to run those servers, and yeah. So
it's never just money, though, is it? As in, money requires justification. And in the US, there's a long-running conversation about the legality of morality in business, which is a really interesting construct. But effectively, you've got large shareholders who would say that a company that forgoes profit for the sake of ethics and morality are actually undermining their fiduciary responsibility to the shareholders of that business, and are therefore negligent and are therefore liable. So you have constructed a set of commercial rules that actually disallow that form of ethics and morality in a lot of instances.
Or start the B Corp instead.
Well, but then traditionally, B Corps don't scale well. They're not funded well, and I suppose it's not a simple answer. This is the thing. We could look at a plethora of different subjects here. We will find ourselves running into this challenge over and over again, which is that the traditional commercial construct of a business, it can't solve for every problem. And we're seeing that it fails over and over again. It's very good at doing one thing: finding a customer, developing a customer, selling to a customer, making profit. That's what it's there for. But we have a whole raft of new nuanced issues in society now that it's not good at solving for. And I wonder to what extent it's actually fair to ask a construct that was designed specifically to generate a profit or to find a customer to actually do things that it was never designed for. But the problem is we've also built a system around that says this is the only mechanism that we will fund, because we live in a society where that incentive structure is quite elegant, is well refined, well designed, and functions.
We might have a small opportunity, actually. So right now in Europe and in many other countries, actually, there is a very big push to create alternative to American technology, right? I think the Europeans want to be sovereign. They realize that they have too many dependency on every single thing from, masks to, social networks and search engine. But the way that Europe has been doing it has been to create massive funding programs, billions and billions of euros, that goes to some sort of group of companies that end up failing miserably, because even with $10 billion, you're not going to compete with Google. However, if you gave, $1 billion to an open source, Google-like project, the community effect of having so much funding could actually be a chance. So maybe those structures are open source projects. Maybe this is how we can think about it. It's like governments are incentivized to create alternatives, right, which are not owned and controlled by some foreign government or entity. And one way of doing that is massively funding open source projects.
Yeah, I'd build on that actually, Rand, as well. I think that sorry, Michelle, I'll jump in for a second and then push the ball your way. But the EU, to a degree, is an open source project. It's got a population of contributors who are all active to various different levels, and they contribute to the way that community is built, and it's been very effective. And I would say to some extent the EU has been the most effective and most successful open source project in history. I would also say that after the crash in 2008, the EU understood at that point that the industries that Europe is good at, or traditional manufacturing industries, are not what is going to make Europe successful in the future, and that they needed to begin to build international technology companies from Europe. And they had failed to do that utterly. And we found ourselves in a situation in Europe that every year we've massive cash outflows going to the US in the form of digital goods and services. And I think at that point, the EU started working on PSD2, MiFID II, GDPR, a slate of legislation that are the beginnings of an infrastructure, a Rails infrastructure for the EU that will look at identity, data, and payments that if you are in the EU will simplify a lot of what we do. So if you are moving to Stockholm from Madrid, that instead of having to have references in Stockholm, you have got an API infrastructure that allows for anonymized checking of credentials for a particular person so that they can easily rent that apartment. Very simple example. But the other side of that is it allows the EU to put a moat up between itself and the outside world. If you're a Facebook or you're an Apple, not only will you have to maybe abide by the rules to enter that market, which you do now, but you may also have to pay to run on those rails. You need to pay to play within that space, providing an advantage to European companies to start therein. So I do think, I would say the EU, there's criticisms I think that are reasonable as well. And even with GDPR, it's proven to be toothless so far. It's had a great effect globally, but the GDPR ombudsman sits in Dublin, and in Dublin you've got most of the American tech businesses, European headquarters in the EU. And could you think of a worse place to put the ombudsperson for that is meant to regulate the data challenges presented by these companies? They're right next door to them. And I think that's part of the reason why GDPR has been redundant so far. Having said that, I do think that the EU understand this issue and are working towards a model that provides ownership of data to the individual in a way that allows them to utilize and commercialize it in effectively an open source way that allows third-party access and product distribution from third parties onto a vetted Rails infrastructure, which is actually a possible solution for a lot of the challenges that we've talked about when we look at commercial infrastructure and commercial challenges presented to our data rights. Okay, so I'm going to move us on. We haven't got much longer left, and there is something I really want to talk about, which is a distinction between anonymity and privacy. So these are two terms which are often used almost synonymously, but they're not the same thing. They're very, very different. And Gabriella, I'd love to hear from you on your view on this. Actually, Michelle, did I skip by you? You wanted to say something?
I just wanted to vouch. No, it's very brief. I wanted to vouch for voting with your wallet or voting with your feet with regards to using these tech companies, because I mean, Google goes away the moment you stop searching on it or using its email and map services, etc. And that's always viable. There are remarkable alternatives to everything that is advertising backed, and I think we change the world by changing ourselves in a way. So if we go first and stop using Google, others will follow.
There's somebody who is an expert in behavioral sciences would be ideal to chime in here. There's something about critical mass when it comes to movement off of these platforms that you reach a point where it very quickly degrades after you have a certain number of exits. Unfortunately, what we've seen historically is, over the last 10 years anyway, is that people have actually moved to companies that are worse when it comes to privacy, not better. If you look at TikTok as an example now, so we're looking at companies who are taking even more data, stripping more people's privacy away rather than less. So we haven't reached that cultural point at which people say, actually, I am being hurt by this in a significant systemic way. The degradation of my privacy is actually degrading my capacity for a fulfilled life. And that might take some time.
That might also never happen.
Yeah.
As in, like the pain might never be strong enough or high enough. Like,
Yeah. So Gabriella, can I ask you about anonymity? Because you've done a lot of work on Anonymous, which I'd love to hear from as well, because it comes back to a lot of the points that have been made. That is a group of people who are effectively voting with their feet. It is people who are whistleblowers and taking action and trying to lead by example to a degree as well, and design the world they want to live in or create a world of their own design. But before we get there, I'd love to hear you make a distinction between anonymity and privacy.
Sure. So privacy and anonymity are often collapsed because the conditions that lead to the erosion of anonymity lead to the erosion of anonymity. But they are quite different insofar as anonymity generally allows people to speak or act in a public way without being identified visually or having their actions or words be attached to a legal identity, right? So that's one definition of anonymity. It's existed for a long time. I mean, women used to publish pseudonymously or as anonymous in an era where it was frowned upon if you were a female author, right? It's quite connected to issues of free speech because it allows you to speak freely. And technological conditions have actually enabled anonymity to flourish online, even as it's very hard to achieve foolproof technical anonymity. And I would finish by saying that while privacy has been hard to establish, privacy is generally seen as a social good. It's often identified with human rights. Anonymity, on the other hand, often has a bad reputation, right? People kind of identify it with bad actors, and in part because it does enable bad actors, especially online. But its reputation is much, much harder to defend, I find, even though it's gotten a little easier than something like privacy.
You caught my next question there, which was about to be how, if I use Twitter as an example, it seems to me that Twitter is a great, if somebody wanted to present a case against anonymity, Twitter is the case in point. You just hand Twitter to somebody and say, this is why there should not be anonymity in a developed democracy. It's also, I can totally understand the case for anonymity in an environment where people are oppressed to some extent. So how do we maintain a case for anonymity in an environment where freedom of expression is celebrated?
I just think that even in places where you have, somewhat functioning democracies, you still need anonymity or, an ability to be pseudonymous, right? There's a lot of people who are sharing information about their health conditions, their sexuality, their political position that need to be covered, right? If we had to reveal ourselves at all times and all moments, it would be oppressive. I do think it's important, and this is something I've mentioned quite a bit in my writing. I mean, anonymity isn't just an unalloyed social good. Bad actors will use it, right? And so it's a balancing act, and different platforms have to come up with mechanisms by which, they provide safety and security measures for those accounts, or to say, that are harassing, right? So with Twitter, I'm super glad that you can have pseudonymous accounts. That's one of the reasons why Anonymous, the kind of hacktivist collective, thrived there. But, if accounts are harassing other people, well, Twitter has the power to take those down, right? So you could have a system where you have an ability to be pseudonymous, but it comes with certain sort of responsibilities as well. And those who are custodians of the platform have to act when there's a violation with accounts that are anonymous or not anonymous.
Is there a case to be made for kind of a social dark web, which is to say that if I stick with Twitter as an example, if somebody is a troll or a griefer on Twitter and they're abusive to somebody, first of all, they could maintain that it's their right. If they're US based, it's their right to freedom of speech. If they're European, they consider it right to freedom of expression, and that may be upheld by Twitter at that point. If they are kicked off the platform, they can just set up a new account quite easily. There's nothing really preventing them most of the time from doing so. Is there a case to be made across these social platforms for people to opt in or opt out of anonymity? And by that, what I mean is, if I use Twitter, that somebody can say, I don't want to see any non-verified accounts. So if you're not a verified account, if there's no documentation of your identity somewhere, that you can't be held responsible for the things that you say and do on this platform. I want to cut you out of my social life experience. Is that a good thing or a bad thing if we were to create a full dark web or a deeper social web of pseudonymity and anonymity? And maybe it's a very good thing, because what you'd have then maybe is, instead of an anonymous population now that are oftentimes the instigators of trolling or griefing or some form of abuse, instead it would create a space where people who were anonymous with purpose, and they were there to with some justifiable reason. Maybe it gives them more focus.
I'm a little bit confused by your question, because one part was like, is it okay if you have the kind of capacity to block people who are not verified and who are anonymous, right? And then there is another part, which is about
maybe it gives it, so the first part is the primary question. Is that a
Right.
positive thing or does it have negative consequences? And the addendum was that it might actually give that dark social web more purpose by the constituents of that place then will actually be there with a reason, with intent, rather than being there because that's what everybody else is, especially if you're a troll, for instance. What's the point in being a troll on a dark social web? No one's going to care. It doesn't matter. So it feels to me like there's positives to it, but maybe you see something in that as well that would be distinctly negative.
Right. I mean, it's sometimes it's very hard to predict how these features will play out. I do think that it is important, however, for platforms to precisely experiment with different ways to deal with the problem, right? As opposed to just sort of having a hands-off approach. I know that's maybe not a satisfying answer. The other thing too, I mean, it's not quite related to your question, but I'll go there anyways, is that I just don't want a monoculture out there, right? So I think that there should be diversity of platforms that allow different types of configurations around anonymity and legal visibility. Like, I think it's fine to have certain platforms that disallow anonymity, right? But if that's the only thing that's allowed on the internet, that becomes the norm, then I would worry, right? So you have to have providers, give providers autonomy to make decisions about how they want to curate their community, but do so in a way that doesn't, in this case, sideline anonymity completely as a value.
Sure. Okay, so 2 sets of questions left here. I'd like to talk to you quickly about Anonymous, and then we'll do the wrap up. So a couple minutes left. Anonymous is this kind of wonderful example of how we see digital dissent emerge and how we see decentralized and autonomous communal constructs come together over a set of ideals, maybe, or rather than a set of intentions, but how intentions can be formed. So do you see Anonymous maybe as a forerunner to, if society if we see more surveillance society and we see greater depreciation of privacy, are we likely to see more community constructs that are purpose-built to avoid that, to mitigate it, or to attack that in some way?
I hope so, because I do think that's important for many different reasons, one of which is just protection from the states. I also think that it's important to sort of note that an anonymous collective has to have strong ethical values around equality and justice to work. Otherwise, it could degrade very quickly because there's certain harms that come with anonymity and secrecy, right? So it's not simply that anonymity should be valued, but it should be valued in relation to other values as well. And then finally, I mean, this is a slightly separate but still connected issue. Social movements often do fall prey to the media harping on a couple of leaders and celebrities, and that often causes a lot of problems. And so I think it's good for social movements, even those that are not like fully anonymous, to think about how to distribute power among spokespeople, right?
Yeah.
And Anonymous provides a great example of that because they refuse to kind of buy into that logic, right? And I think that's also a very kind of powerful element. But no, you need some level of anonymity and secrecy often in political organizing, but it has to be done thoughtfully. And Anonymous is only one example. There's a long history of it. The Carbonari in Italy, was a secret society that was kind of essential for bringing liberal democratic reforms, right? There's many sort of examples in history that we can turn to, and we should turn to precisely because it provides a good measure of protection, but it has to be done kind of thoughtfully in order for it to work.
I think we'd love to follow up with you on this topic, then for another chat. To round it up, Michelle, you're the most articulate voice I know on the future. What is your view on how the next decade is likely to evolve when it comes to privacy in particular? What, in 10 years' time, are we living in a privacy dystopia, or have we found ways to correct some of the slide that we've seen?
I think dystopias always coexist with utopias. It depends on sort of where you're at. It's never one or the other. And I see more of the same in many ways. So I mean, there's no reason as for why the existing technology powers would go away in the next decade. So I mean, they're always changing priorities. As Rand said, I mean, Google will be around in a decade, even if they have to offer private services. They'll figure out a way to remain in power, and and they'll keep undercutting our privacy rights to the best of their capacity. That's what they do, I think. But I also see sort of a shift in awareness of the impact of these tools. So I think people are opting out. People are replacing the mainstream alternative with something more private. It might or might not be as extreme as Tor, but having a private browser goes a long way. And so you can buy into that to some effect, or at least you can trust some companies over others. So I think the struggle will remain over the next decade. We'll see more of on both sides. And I hope the Chinese model doesn't become sort of the de facto standard, because I can imagine a lot of governments looking at that and like, ooh, we need this. Same as with the policing, like, yeah, we need more of this, and that's not in the interest of the population.
Rand, you've dedicated a career so far to successfully creating technologies and companies that look at this topic from a different point of view and finding ways to achieve commercial success in doing so through privacy in AI or through decentralized products. What do you think your next 10 years look like in that domain? Do you think it's going to get harder for you, or do you think that you're likely to see increasing demand make this an easier space for you to work in?
I mean, it seems to be easier, because people are now like trying to find solutions. I think, the way that I think about what's going to happen in 10 years. So 10 years ago, what I was trying to advocate for was privacy by design, right? Meaning that you have to bake privacy into the way you build your product. I think today I'm actually advocating for something even more radical, which I call zero trust. So technology basically should not require you to trust anybody. And this is different from privacy, because privacy by design, you're kind of still trusting whoever's offering the service that they've done it right. The idea of zero trust is much like Bitcoin. There is no central authority that you're actually trusting in the first place. And when it comes to internet services, it could be something like having the browser manage your encryption key so that everything becomes end-to-end encrypted. So it doesn't matter even if a service wants to cheat, because they wouldn't be able to control what happens browser side. So you're still trusting the browser, which is why you need things like Tor and so on and so forth. So I think when you get into this kind of like zero trust internet mindset, you find that it's the intersection of encryption, it's the intersection of encryption, blockchain, open source, dark web technologies. All of these things sort of like merge together at some point. And I'm pretty confident, if not in a decade, within 20 years, this will become pretty normal. Like there is a cycle in technology that we go back and forth between decentralized and open to proprietary and closed. It's the internet. The computer was initially, a cool technology. Then Windows came, it was closed. And the internet came, it was open. Then mobile phone came, it was closed. And whatever is happening next is actually becoming open again. There's a great book that I recommend reading that I really like. I think it was such a brilliant foresight in the future. It was written in the 80s by someone actually who is a pseudonym, Hakim Bey. He wrote an essay called The Temporary Autonomous Zone, which pretty much predicted everything we see emerging online today, including dissident groups using the internet as a way of expression and things like that. So like it's people have been thinking about those ideas. The technology wasn't ready, adoption wasn't ready, but there is definitely like an inflection point in the curve, which if we don't artificially stop, should lead us to what I believe is going to be the real vision of the internet.
Great.
Happening in DC, which has like a temporary autonomous zone.
Yeah.
Gabriella.
Yeah, no, I'm just super excited by what Rand has said. And, you know, if I look out my window, there's like massive construction going on, which is really annoying, but they are fixing the pipes, which is nice. And the reason why I raise this is because, you know, you can't get a bunch of people like Rand together to start, you know, building bridges or busting streets open. You get in trouble. The police would whisk you away. But that's what's so great about software, right? Is that you can just come together and be like, okay, we're going to build new infrastructure. And Rand is completely right. There's some really exciting technological possibilities. And already the foundation is there. And it's about like completing that over the next 10 to 20 years. And my worry, or something that I'm concerned about, is precisely how to create institutions, corporations, nonprofits, that have the funding to pay the people like Rand to do the work, right? Just because there's so many opportunities to make money and make really good money in the other areas, right? We have to create funnels to get people with technological capacities and people with design experience as well to continue to build what is being built, right? So we have to think about those structures, institutional and funding, because the technology is there and I think the desire is there as well.
Agreed.
Fantastic.
Agreed.
Look, that's all we have time for. We've run a little bit over as usual. I'd like to thank you all very, very much.
Thank you, John. Thank you,
coming along
Gabriella.
today.
Thank you, Michelle.
And
Thank you.
if you want to find out more about Atelier, you can find us on Twitter at L'Atelier, or you can find us online at atelier.net. So for Michell Zappa in Sao Paulo, for Rand Hindi in Paris, for Dr. Gabriela Coleman in Montreal, and for myself also in Paris, thank you very, very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having us.